everyone, welcome back to my channel for a brand new mystery with Molly. If you are new around here, if you have never seen my face on your screen before, then hi, my name is Molly and I post true crime videos like this every single week. So if you think that that is something that you might want to stick around for, then please do subscribe and don't forget to switch on the little notification bell so that YouTube will let you know whenever I post a new video. This week we are going to be talking about the solved case of the Kapunda triple murders. In late 2010, the brutal and tragic murders of a normal happy family occurred in a small town in Australia, and when the victims were found, it wouldn't be too long before a suspect was identified and a motive of jealousy came to light. But quickly before we get into the case, I would just like to say a special thank you to Audible for kindly sponsoring this section of the video. Audible is the leading provider of spoken word entertainment and audiobooks. You guys know that I've been using their service for a very long time. The reason I love them so much is because they have such an incredible, huge selection of audiobooks, and there are so many different genres to choose from. They have bestsellers, they have new releases, celebrity memoirs, mysteries and thrillers, my personal favorite genre. They also have audiobooks about wellness and motivation, business, and even more. Audible members are given 1 credit every single month, and this credit can be used to purchase any title in the entire premium selection, no matter what the price, and then that title is yours to keep. And members also get access to the many different podcasts in the Audible collection. I like to listen to the podcast via the Audible app. I've spoken before about how I absolutely love the app. It makes it super easy to listen to your titles anytime, anywhere. The audiobook that I purchased this month was this one, The Hillside Stranglers, the inside story of the killing spree that terrorized Los Angeles. I mentioned a few videos ago about possibly covering the Hillside Strangler case sometime soon, and so many of you guys said that you would be really interested in seeing that. So don't worry, it is coming. This audiobook is really helping me to get a head start on my research. If you would like to give Audible a try yourself, then you can go to audible.com/Molly, or you can text Molly to 500 to start your free 30-day trial. Again, that's audible.com/Molly, or you can text Molly to 500. Thank you so much to Audible again for sponsoring this video and supporting the channel. Thank you to you guys for always supporting the sponsors on this channel. And now let's just get into the case. So for this week's case, we are going back almost 12 years now to 2010 in Kapunda, which is a town located in South Australia. Kapunda is a pretty small town in South Australia. According to the 2016 census, it has a population of about 2,900, just over 2,900 people. It's actually the oldest mining town in Australia, so they often have tourists go there to explore the mines. And on the whole, Kapunda was just known as being a relatively normal, nice, friendly area where crime rates were low. It was a safe area, or at least it used to be that way. It was that way up until 2010. Towards the end of 2010, a tragic and gruesome crime occurred in the town, a crime that completely shook the residents of Kapunda and left everyone feeling devastated and absolutely terrified because a killer was on the loose. The date was the 8th of November 2010, and that morning the police were called to a house located on Harriet Street in Kapunda because 3 dead bodies had been found inside. Now, I'm actually unsure of the circumstances surrounding the discovery of these bodies. I'm not entirely sure who came across the scene first and then contacted the police, but regardless, the police were contacted. They were sent to the house on Harriet Street, and inside was truly horrifying. The inside of this house was like something you would see in a horror movie. There was blood everywhere, absolutely everywhere in this house, all over the floors, on the walls, I think in every single room. And it didn't take long for the police to work out where this blood had come from. It had obviously come from these 3 poor victims, these 3 bodies that were found, they had clearly been the targets of a very, very brutal attack. One of the victims was found on the floor by the back door of the property. One of them was discovered in the kitchen, and the 3rd victim was discovered on a bed in one of the bedrooms. And initially, when the police arrived, paramedics were also brought to the scene to see if there was any chance that any of these 3 people could have still been alive and could have been saved. But unfortunately, it was way too late. They were already deceased by the time emergency services arrived, and they had been for a good few hours by this point, so there was no saving them. And it was clear from the state of the scene, from all of the blood, and from looking at these 3 bodies, that this was a homicide that the police were dealing with, a triple homicide. These 3 people had been murdered. So of course, the very first thing that the police needed to do in this case was actually identify these victims, determine who they were, and then maybe from there they might be able to identify who actually did this to them. And it didn't take long for the police to establish their identities. The victims were actually the occupants of that house, a man named Andrew Rowe and his wife Rosemary Rowe, and their daughter Chantal, who was just a teenager. This family had been brutally killed in their own home. Now, Chantal wasn't an only child. She had an older brother, and his name was Christopher. He didn't live with his family anymore. He had moved out, but he lived nearby with his girlfriend. However, at the time that his family were killed, he was on holiday on the Gold Coast in Queensland. And this is awful, but he actually heard about the murders via the media. Well, he didn't know that his family had been killed. This was literally when the news had just broke, so I don't even think the police had announced that this was a murder case yet. But Christopher saw on the news that something bad had happened on the street where his parents and his little sister lived. People had been killed there, and obviously he immediately started to worry, and so he posted a status on his Facebook asking if any of his friends could just make sure that his family were okay, check on them. And someone did reply saying that all was good, his family were fine. However, tragically, this person that replied had made a mistake. Apparently they just got confused with which house on Harriet Street it was where the people were killed. They didn't realise that it was the Rose house. So Christopher had been told that his family were fine, but they weren't. And of course, he later learned the devastating truth that every single member of his family was dead. The police did have to look into Christopher as a potential person of interest in the very beginning of this case, just in case he might have had anything to do with it, but of course he didn't. He was hours and hours and hours away when it happened, so he was ruled out. So just for a bit of background on the Rowe family, Andrew Rowe was aged 45 at the time that this case took place. His wife Rosemary was 44, Chantal was 16 years old, and Christopher was just under 10 years older than his little sister. He was 25, I believe. And the family had lived in Kapunda for a couple of years by this point, and they were happy living there. They were settled in the town. Andrew Rowe had his own business. He ran a carpet cleaning company, and I'm not entirely sure what Rosemary did, whether she worked, but I have a quote here from Christopher in which he is talking about his mum, and he said, "You could never be bored with my mum. She was so funny. She was the handyman around the house and would teach me to fix things." He also said about his little sister Chantal, quote, "Chantal was saying that she couldn't wait to be 18 and go out with me and my friends and socialise with us. I planned to teach her to drive when I got back from my Queensland holiday. Now I will not get the chance to do that." From what I can gather, the Rowe family were just a very nice, normal, happy family. So then why had this happened? Why did someone decide to do this to them? Well, that is what the South Australian police now had to figure out. A murder investigation was quickly launched and the hunt was on to find the perpetrator. Following the discovery of the bodies, the crime scene, the house, was sectioned off by police, and Andrew, Rosemary and Chantal eventually underwent a post-mortem, which confirmed that their cause of deaths was from the many stab wounds that they had each sustained. This was such a horrific attack. All three of them had been stabbed by the killer repeatedly with a knife. In total, Andrew Rowe sustained 29 stab wounds all over his body. His wife Rosemary was stabbed more than 50 times, and Chantal had a total of 33 stab wounds. And it was also determined in her autopsy that Chantal had sadly also been raped by the attacker. As I mentioned earlier, there was blood everywhere in the house, which indicated to the police that the attack wasn't just in one place, it was going on all throughout the home, and there had been a very, very violent struggle between the killer and the victims. They all tried desperately hard to fight for their lives, especially Andrew and Rosemary. And due to the level of violence, the police did theorize that the murderer probably wasn't a stranger to the family. These murders were so vicious and so brutal, it seemed like whoever did this held a lot of anger towards the family. This was personal, and they wanted to cause them as much pain as they possibly could. They wanted them to suffer. But then, having said that, the police spoke to Christopher Rowe, and he couldn't think of anyone that would have wanted to do this to them. As far as he knew, his family had no known enemies, so the police started trying to come up with other theories, other potential motives that the killer might have had. It didn't appear as though this was a robbery because the house wasn't ransacked, nothing was really stolen. The police did investigate the possibility that perhaps this crime was drug related. Were the family involved in drugs? Did they perhaps owe someone very dangerous some money and they were killed because they hadn't paid it back? But that theory was also quickly eliminated. The Rowe family weren't involved in anything like that. The details from 16-year-old Chantal's post-mortem indicated that this crime was probably sexually motivated. Chantal was the motive. The killer did what he did that night because he wanted to rape Chantal, and he killed her parents just to get them out of the way, and then he killed her so that she wouldn't have been able to tell the police who did this. If he killed all three of them, then there were no witnesses. As part of the murder investigation, the police obviously conducted house-to-house inquiries. They were speaking to everyone who lived in the area, asking if they had any information that possibly could have been relevant to this case. And as all of this was going on, the police were also following up on any tips and leads that they had received from the public. And there was one in particular that they received that looked like it could be quite promising. Basically, one day shortly after the family were killed, the police received a call from a member of the public. They didn't give over their name, it was an anonymous call, but this person said that they had recently come across a post that someone had made on Facebook, and they thought that it was quite alarming. This Facebook post basically said something along the lines of, "I've done something really bad, I'm really sorry, I don't know how I'm going to live with myself." And when the person who contacted the police read it, they just thought that maybe it was connected to the Rowe family murders. The post didn't specifically mention murder, but the way that it was written, you know, saying, "I don't know how I'm going to live with myself," it was clear that the writer had a guilty conscience about something because of something that they had done. Was that something the murders? Was this post on Facebook kind of a confession? So when the police received this information, they decided to look further into this Facebook lead. They identified the person who wrote it, and they found that he actually lived fairly close to the Rowe's home where the murders occurred. And apparently he did know the Rowe family. I'm not entirely sure how he knew them and what exactly his connection to them was, but the police did start to think that maybe this is it. Maybe this really is the perpetrator. So the man was interviewed and he was asked by detectives about his Facebook post. What was he talking about? What was he referring to in it? And he said that he was just talking about an argument that he had had with, I think, a member of his family, and the police did seem to believe him, and eventually he was pretty much ruled out of the investigation. So because that lead resulted in a dead end, the hunt for the real killer continued, and in the days after the crime, the police got to work on trying to establish what the family had actually been doing in the lead up to their deaths. What were their last known movements? Because maybe once they had worked that out, they might be able to identify some people of interest. Now, it was determined that I believe just 2 nights before they were killed and their bodies were found, so this would have been the evening of Saturday the 6th of November 2010. Obviously their bodies were found on the morning of the 8th of November. It was determined that on the 6th of November, Andrew and Rosemary had gone out to Adelaide in Australia because they were attending a party there that evening, and their daughter Chantal was hosting her own party that night. She had the house to herself, so she did what I think most other teenagers would do, and she invited a couple of her friends round. They just stayed around for a while whilst her parents were out, and they had some food, had some drinks, watched some films, until eventually they left and Andrew and Rosemary returned home the next morning. So after learning about this, the police decided that they needed to speak to all of the people that attended Chantal's party or gathering that night, because who knows, maybe one of those people were involved in the murders. So they did just that. They interviewed each of them, and they were all very, very willing to assist with the police inquiries. They were all cooperative, and the detectives didn't believe that any of them had anything to do with the crime. They also spoke to Chantal's boyfriend. She had a boyfriend at the time, so he was looked into as a potential suspect, but he was also ultimately ruled out. He was innocent. So the police still had nothing. They still had no solid suspects, no idea who committed this crime, but they were hopeful that they would receive some clues from the forensic teams who had been sent into the house to try and find some evidence. They hoped that they would find traces of the offender's DNA, and luckily they did. On Chantal's bedroom door, they discovered a fingerprint in blood, and this fingerprint didn't match Chantal's prints, nor did it match her parents, Andrew and Rosemary. So the police believed that it belonged to the killer, and so they entered this print onto the National Fingerprint Database, but unfortunately no match came up, suggesting that the killer had never actually committed a crime before, or at least they had never been caught. But that wasn't the only DNA evidence the police had obtained of the killer. Remember, Chantal was raped that night, so they were able to collect traces of the murderer's semen from her body. And after conducting some tests, scientists were able to get a DNA profile from the semen. So again, this DNA profile was entered onto the DNA database, but still no match was found, which of course was so disappointing for the police, but at least they had DNA. This was such a huge piece of evidence, and it meant that if they did have future suspects, they could compare their DNA to the killer's to see if it was a match. The police did start approaching all of the males in Chantal's life, all of her male friends, and they were asked to provide their DNA so that the police could positively rule them out as being the killer. And as the detectives were kind of going through all of the boys and the men that Chantal knew, as they were going through all of the statements that each of these men had given, there was one in particular that just suddenly jumped out at the police. They had previously taken a statement from an 18-year-old man named Jason Downey, who was kind of friends with Chantal. I think he was more friends with Chantal's boyfriend than her, but Chantal did know him. So the police had spoken to this Jason Downey earlier on in the investigation, and at the time he didn't seem suspicious at all. He didn't raise any alarm bells or anything. However, when they went back over his statement, they realised something. They realised that during their conversation with him, Jason Downey had started to provide the police with an alibi for the night that the Rowe family were killed. But the thing is, the police never asked. They never asked him to provide an alibi. So they just thought it was quite strange that he was so keen and so quick to offer one when they didn't even ask him to. So because this seemed a little bit odd, the detectives decided that they were going to look a little bit more into 18-year-old Jason Downey as a potential person of interest. So they went to go and speak with him on the 14th of November 2010, about 6 days after the murders. And one of the first things that detectives noticed was that he had quite a lot of very deep cuts and wounds on his hand. I think mainly on his left hand. Now this instantly stood out to detectives because obviously the Rowe family were all killed using a knife. They were each stabbed over and over again. And as we know, there was a violent struggle between them and the murderer. So it is more than likely that the perpetrator would have been injured himself during the attack, that the knife would have slipped and cut him. And here was Jason Downey with so many cuts all over his hands. So they asked him how he got those injuries, and he just said that he had had an accident. He had recently fallen off of his bike, and that was how he cut his hand. And I believe he claimed that on the night of the murders, he wasn't even in the area. He wasn't in Kapunda. He had driven to another town nearby and he'd gone out for some food. That was his alibi. So they asked Downey if he wouldn't mind just providing the police with some DNA samples, and he said yes, that was fine. He was willing to do that. So they took his DNA, they took his fingerprints, and his samples were sent off for testing, and less than 2 days later the results were in. Scientists got in contact with the detectives working on this case, and they revealed that Jason Downey's DNA was a match. His DNA matched the semen that was collected from Chantal Rowe's body. Jason Downey was the killer. But let's pause the actual case here for a second and talk a little bit more about Jason Downey and his background and his life leading up to this point. Now, interestingly, Jason wasn't actually from Australia. He was originally from a town called Kilmarnock, which is in Scotland. And it wasn't until he was around 14 years old that he and his family moved to the other side of the world, to Kapunda in Australia. Jason's mother was named Lorna, and I couldn't find the name of his biological father. From what I can gather, Jason never really had anything to do with him. According to one source, his father walked out on the family when Jason was literally just a couple of months old, so he never really had that father figure in his life. Jason was one of 3 children, I believe. He had a brother named Jamie and a sister named Jodie, and the reason the family moved to Australia when he was a young teenager is because his mother was in a relationship with a man from there, so they decided to move to be closer to him. Although his sister Jodie stayed behind, she stayed in Scotland. It seems as though when Jason moved, he did struggle to kind of settle in Kapunda. Obviously, this was such a huge life-changing thing for someone so young, moving to a different country, not knowing anyone, having to make new friends. And I think he struggled with that a lot. He didn't really fit in with his peers at school. Many of them thought that he was quite weird and odd for some reason, so he never really had many friends. He was a bit of a loner. But he met Chantal Rowe when he first moved to Kapunda because he began attending the same school that she went to. And like I said earlier, they were kind of friends, or I guess maybe acquaintances was a better word for it. Jason was more friends with Chantal's boyfriend, so they would hang out sometimes. Chantal really didn't think much of Jason. However, he thought a lot of her. It turns out that he had a crush on Chantal, a huge crush. Even though she was dating his friend, he really liked her and he wanted to be with her. In fact, Jason Downey pretty much became fixated with Chantal. He would text her all the time and ring her constantly, and she was polite and kind to him. You know, she wouldn't just ignore him, she would respond, and she probably didn't think much of it. She had no idea just how obsessed with her he was. So when the police found all of this out, of course it raised alarm bells instantly. They started thinking, was that why he killed Chantal? He was jealous that she wasn't with him, she was with someone else, and so he decided that if he couldn't have her, then no one could. So after the police had the results of the DNA test and they were informed that Jason Downey matched the DNA collected from Chantal's body, they began putting their plan together to arrest him, although they weren't too sure exactly how they were going to do this at first, because Jason Downey was clearly a very, very dangerous individual, and they didn't want to just go to his house and arrest him there because he still lived with his family, and they were worried that if he saw the police approaching, he might have panicked and done something to his family. He might have tried to take them hostage or something. So the police didn't want to make the arrest at his home in fear that they might be putting the other people that lived there at risk, but they also didn't want to arrest him at his work because Jason Downey worked as a mechanic at a garage, and of course in a garage there are a lot of tools around that he could possibly grab and use as a weapon against the officers that were trying to apprehend him. So instead of going to him to make the arrest, the police decided to try and see if they could get Downey to come to them. They basically got in contact with Downey and they asked him if he could come down to the police station because they just needed him to sign the statement that he had previously made to the police. They obviously didn't tell him that they were planning to arrest him. They just said, can you pop in and quickly sign your statement for us? And he agreed. So he made his way to the station, and as soon as he arrived, he was arrested on suspicion of the murders of the Rowe family. Following his arrest, Jason was interviewed by detectives and he denied everything. He said that he had nothing to do with the murders, it was not him. And so the police said to him, well, explain then how traces of your semen were collected from Chantal Rowe's body. And he basically said that he had sex with Chantal before. The two of them had consensual sex, but he said that it was months before the murders occurred. And so the police said, well, if it was months before, your DNA wouldn't still be present on Chantal's body. But I don't believe he really said anything in response to that. He just kind of ignored it. I mean, what could he say? And he stuck to the story that he gave in his original statement. He stuck to his alibi that he had been out of town on the night of the murders. He actually said that he had an argument with his mum that night, and so he never went home. He decided to sleep in his car. But he couldn't prove that what he was saying was true. He couldn't prove his alibi, and the police knew that it was a lie anyway. The DNA evidence linking Jason to the crime was such solid evidence. They knew that they had the right guy. They knew that he was the killer. And so they charged him. He was charged with 3 counts of murder. But he remained adamant that he was not responsible. He was innocent. He even denied everything to his family members. Whilst he was being held in custody, he was writing letters to his family saying that it wasn't him. But something that he did tell his family, which the police later found out about, was that he claimed to them that he was in the Rose family home that night, but that he wasn't the one who killed them. He came up with this insane story about how he witnessed a man holding a green shopping bag and wearing all dark clothing entering the house that night, and that this man was the murderer. He told his family that he was, for some reason, just in the house when the murders happened, and that he cradled Chantal and he comforted her while she lay dying. But he said that he wasn't the one who killed her. This man in the dark clothing did, and he just happened to be there. He never told the police this story, I don't believe, probably because it is so obviously fake, but that is what he told his mum and his siblings in these letters that he was writing. So because he was denying it, the police were, of course, expecting the case to go to trial. They were expecting him to plead not guilty. And so before that happened, they wanted to make sure that they had enough evidence against him as possible to ensure a conviction. So whilst he was being being held in custody, they continued working on building their case, and they did discover even more evidence that connected him to the crime. So firstly, something that the police collected from the crime scene after the bodies were found was a camera, a digital camera that the family owned. Now, they went through the pictures on this camera and they found that some of the last pictures that were ever taken was from the afternoon of Sunday, the 7th of November. So just the day before the family were found dead. The family had taken some photos of each other whilst they were having lunch that day, and the police noticed that in one of these photos, Chantal was holding a USB stick, like a memory stick. And when Jason Downey was later identified as the main suspect in the investigation and his home was searched, the police found this exact USB stick, Chantal's USB stick, in his bedroom. So that proved that he had stolen it from the house during the murders. I don't know why he stole it. He probably just wanted to see what was on it, I guess. In addition to that, the lanyard that the USB stick was attached to, Chantal's lanyard, was later found in his car. And when the police searched Chantal's laptop, they found that on the night of the murders, actually after the police believed the murders took place, someone had tried to log in to Chantal's laptop, but they were unable to because they didn't know her password. And there was a little bit of blood on the keyboard. So again, it's believed that Jason Downey was the one who did this. For some unknown reason, he wanted to get into her laptop. But going back to his car for a second, as well as the lanyard, the police also discovered traces of blood in there. And when tested, it was determined that the blood in his car was a match to two of the victims, Andrew Rowe and his wife Rosemary. Shoe prints in the house, the killer's shoe prints, also matched the size of Downey's feet and a pair of shoes that he owned. He actually got rid of the shoes after the murders, but Downey's mother said that he only owned like 3 pairs of shoes anyway, and so she told them which pair was missing, and the pair that was missing matched the kind of shoes that the police believed made the shoe prints in the house. And of course, on top of all of that, they also had the semen evidence, and it was eventually confirmed that his fingerprint was a match to that bloody fingerprint that was found on Chantal's bedroom door. So the police were confident going forward. They were confident that they had collected enough evidence to prove in court that Jason Downey was the one who did this. And clearly he realised that, because eventually he decided to plead guilty to his charges. Throughout this whole thing, throughout this whole investigation, he was adamant that he was innocent. But it was like as soon as he saw the mountain of evidence the police had against him, he just thought, what's the point in pleading not guilty? He probably knew that there was no chance anyone was going to think he wasn't the killer, so may as well plead guilty so that he can hopefully get a lighter sentence. Despite his guilty plea, the prosecution still went through all of the evidence in court and they presented their version of events, what they believed happened that fateful night based on the evidence. So as we know, as we discussed earlier, Jason Downey had developed an obsession with Chantal Rowe. He wanted her, he wanted to be with her, but of course she wasn't interested in him like that. She was going out with Jason's friend. As we also discussed earlier, just 2 days before the murders, on the 6th of November 2010, Chantal had invited a couple of friends and her boyfriend round to her house for a bit of a party and a movie night whilst her parents went to Adelaide. And Jason Downey was not invited to this party, so it's been theorised that he was quite angry about this, about the fact that Chantal didn't invite him. Now, the next day, so the day before the murders, the police found out that Chantal had, I think, texted her boyfriend, or she'd spoken to him on the phone, and she told him that she wasn't feeling too well. She was feeling a bit poorly. And I believe her boyfriend just briefly mentioned this to his friend, Jason Downey. He mentioned that he was meant to be going to see Chantal that night, night, but that he wasn't going to go because she was ill. And so it's believed that upon hearing this, Jason Downey decided that he was going to take this opportunity. He decided that he was going to go to Chantal's house that night whilst he knew that her boyfriend wouldn't be there, and he was going to have sex with her. And if she didn't want to do it with him, he would rape her. He didn't care. So in the early hours of the morning on the 8th of November 2010, Jason Downey made his way to Harriet Street in Kapunda, and sources state that when he arrived at the Rowe's house, he broke in through their bathroom window. He stayed in the bathroom for a little while, and then from there he claimed, after he finally confessed, that he made his way to Chantal's bedroom, and he was armed, I believe, with 2 knives. And at least one of these knives belonged to the Rowe family. He took it from their kitchen to use in the killing. When he got into Chantal's room, the attack immediately began, and she must have been absolutely terrified. This was the early hours of the morning. The police believe that the attack started sometime around 1 a.m. due to some screaming and some banging that neighbours heard. So it's likely that Chantal was asleep and she would have been woken up to someone attacking her. Jason Downey probably started trying to rape Chantal, and when she began trying to fight him off, he started just stabbing her repeatedly. I'm guessing it was at this point that Andrew and Rosemary must have heard the sound of their daughter being attacked. They would have heard her screaming, and when they did, they immediately confronted Jason Downey, and so he just started attacking them. He stabbed both of them repeatedly, and as I mentioned earlier, they did try to fight back. There was a violent struggle between them, and the attack was happening all over the house. There was blood in every room. The prosecution believe that after Downey had stabbed Andrew and Rosemary a number of times, they obviously fell to the ground. They were severely injured and no longer able to try and defend themselves. And so he headed back to Chantal's bedroom, and by this point, she was still alive and she was literally hiding underneath her bed. She must have been just way too weak from the stab wounds that she had sustained to even try and escape or run out of the house. So all she could do was crawl under her bed and hide and just hope that he wouldn't find her, which is just so awful to think about, because it means that she would have heard the attack on her parents. She was under that bed, bleeding out in so much pain, and at the same time, she was hearing the sound of her parents being brutally attacked and stabbed. She was hearing their screams. But as I said, after Downey attacked Andrew and Rosemary, he went back into Chantal's room and he dragged her out from under her bed. He then dragged her onto the bed and carried on stabbing her with the knife. And according to one source, it was following this when he raped Chantal. As she lay there dying, he raped her. Chantal was stabbed a total of 33 times, and it was established that once she was dead, Downey actually redressed her. He removed her blood-soaked clothing, and then I think he put some clean clothes on her for some reason, and then he just left her body on the bed. After finishing the attack on Chantal, the police believe that he did actually try to clean up the scene a little. He tried to clean up some of the blood in the house using a mop, but he quickly gave up on that, and instead he returned to Andrew's body in the kitchen, and he proceeded to stab him a couple more times just so he could be sure Andrew was dead. And then he did the exact same to Rosemary. The police actually think that Rosemary was still alive at this point and that she was trying to drag herself and crawl to the back door to get out, but sadly before she made it there, Downey attacked her further. He stabbed her again and again and again, more than 50 times in total. I also read on a few sources that Andrew and Rosemary were stabbed so viciously and with so much force that pieces of the knife had actually broken off and were found inside of their bodies. And once he was sure that all 3 of them were dead, Jason Downey left the crime scene. He walked out of the house. After he had entered his guilty plea, Downey explained to the police that he had disposed of some of the evidence. He ditched his shoes and the clothes that he was wearing that night, and he told the police where they could locate them. So they went to that area and they did find the shoes and most of the clothing. He also said that he ditched some of the items that he used to try and clean up the scene, and also the murder weapons, the knives. He disposed of them, and the police tried to retrieve those as well, but unfortunately they were unable to. They couldn't find them, and I think Downey claimed that he couldn't remember exactly where he left them, so I don't believe the knives have ever been found to this day. But anyway, he got rid of the evidence. He said that he slept in his car that night, and then from there he just acted as if nothing ever happened. He acted completely normal. He went to work the next day as he normally would. He even attended a work Christmas party just days after the murders. And when he heard about the murders on the news, he pretended to be really sad. He pretended to grieve. He actually asked his work if he could go home early and have the next day off because he was so shaken up by the news. However, this act of grieving that he put on didn't stop there. This is so incredibly chilling. But after the bodies of Andrew, Rosemary and Chantal were found and the local community heard the awful news, a lot of people went to the scene. They went to Harriet Street and they left cards and bunches of flowers as a kind of tribute to the family to pay their respects. And Jason Downey was one of the many people that did this. He was even caught on video, I think by a news station, placing a teddy bear and a note on the ground next to the flowers that other people had left. And his note read, quote, "To Chantal, may you always be remembered and never forgotten. You'll be missed by everyone, Jason Downey." Which is just absolutely insane. He was pretending to grieve the loss of this family and his friend the whole time, knowing that he was the one who had done this to them. He had taken the lives of 3 innocent people in one of the most brutal ways imaginable, and then he just turned up at the scene with a teddy bear and a card. It's sickening. But going back to the court case, in April of 2012, about a year and a half after the crime, 20-year-old Jason Downey was given a life sentence for the murders of Andrew, Rosemary and Chantal Rowe. And it was decided that he would serve a minimum of 35 years in prison before he was even considered for parole. In the aftermath of this case, Jason Downey actually wrote a letter in which he apologised to the friends and family of his victims. The letter reads, quote, "To all of the friends and family of Chantal, Andrew and Rosemary Rowe. First of all, I would like to apologise for my recent actions on November the 8th, 2010. From the bottom of my heart, I'm deeply sorry for my actions. I have hurt a lot of people for what I've done. I know that no matter what my sentence, it will never be enough. I've caused so much pain not only in my family but many others. I know this apology may not mean a lot to a lot of people. I feel that I have to say sorry as this whole situation is eating me alive. I had a career, car, friends, and most importantly, I had my family. Now due to my recent actions, I have nothing. And as much as I hate to say it, but I deserve anything and everything that is going to happen to me. I take full responsibility for my actions. I would also like to apologise to the brother of the victims, Christopher Rowe. I can't imagine what he would be feeling as he lost the most important people in his life. I want you to know that if I could turn back time and fix my wrongdoings, I would do it in an instant, but unfortunately I can't. So once again, I sincerely apologise for my actions. From the bottom of my heart, I'm truly sorry." End quote. I mean, to me, that letter just screams self-pity. The part part where he says, I had a career, car, friends, and most importantly, I had my family. Now, due to my recent actions, I have nothing. It's honestly like he feels more sorry for himself because he doesn't have those nice things anymore than he does for the friends and family of his victims, the people whose lives he has completely destroyed. I don't think Jason Downey ever fully grasped the seriousness of what he did. I think he pretended to in the letter, he pretended to be sorry, but I don't believe he has the capability to actually understand just how much hurt he has caused. It's almost like he thought, well, if I apologize in a letter, that's my conscience clear. I've said sorry, what more can I do? Of course, the Rowe family, Christopher Rowe, was not at all interested in what Jason Downey had to say. I don't even believe he ever read the letter because he probably thought, what's the point? There is nothing that Jason Downey could have said that could have taken away the pain that he suffered, and I'm sure still suffers with to this day. Jason Downey is, of course, still in prison now. He's been in prison for over a decade, and he will be, I think, in his 50s before he is considered for parole. But that is it for this case. That is the case of the Kapunda triple murders, the murders of Andrew, Rosemary, and Chantal Rowe. A really, really upsetting case, and I'm glad that Jason Downey is going to be in prison for a long time. Let's hope that when he does eventually come up for parole, he won't be released anyway. As always, I would really love to hear what you guys think about this case in the comments. Let me know your thoughts and opinions. Also, let me know of any other cases that you would like to see me cover on this channel. Again, you can let me know in the comments, or alternatively, I do have a case request form linked in the description box. Thank you all so much for watching. Please do give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you again next week for another mystery with Molly.